But I think for me, what I realized was that one of the reasons that people dislike having uncomfortable conversations is because they're either hankering back to a period that will absolve them of the need to have that conversation, or they don't want to face whatever is in them that's causing them some unwillingness. And I exist to challenge the status quo. I don't have a fear associated with that. Maybe not all guns blazing, but I think there are ways in which sensitively you can help people address some of these things. And I knew that God had a heart for reconciliation. I've had an incredible spiritual walk, and part of that has been writing books, part of that has been doing interviews like these. But I really had a conviction that God wanted me to hold out principles of reconciliation to people who don't understand, who don't know that that is possible, and help them dream into the art of the possible.
Hello, I am Rabbi Rami Goldberg, and welcome back to another episode of Biblical Money. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am joined today by Leah Brown. Leah Brown is doing some really amazing things within the world of bringing together different companies and different CEOs and helping them as far as some of their mental health. And I'm going to let her tell us a bit more about it. So tell us a little bit about the organization, the ministry that you've started, because it's kind of like this half ministry, half business situation. So love to hear a little bit more about that.
That's exactly right. Thank you so much for having me on the show as a guest. As you suggested, I run the Wayfinders Group. We are a values-driven, problem-solving consultancy. I spend a lot of my time at the epicenter of dissenting voices. So I work in conflict resolution to help leaders and organizations navigate complexity. And that sits in the change management space. And it's really about having a heart both for reconciliation, but also transformation.
So the Wayfinders Group, you weren't always in ministry, and that wasn't, you were a lawyer before this, I understand. So give us a little bit about how, like, kind of the evolution, because that, I think, very often tells so much of the story of where something is how did it grow to get there? And I always give like an example. We have a tree outside my house that has been growing on this crooked angle for, it's a big tree at this point, because what happened? Some kid, probably one of my kids, was yanking on the tree, pulled it down, and it just kind of grown that way. So hopefully yours is growing up a bit straighter, but tell us a little bit about the evolution for how you got to where the Wayfinders Group is at this point.
It is a little bit like a game of dominoes. I like that tree illustration. So just zooming out a little bit, I've had a background in conflict resolution. My whole life, I didn't really realize it, but I'd spent a lot of time mediating in family conflict situations. And I became a corporate lawyer. I was really attracted to problem solving and working with people and doing interesting technical work. But I became a general counsel of a Goldman Sachs-backed fintech business, and I delivered a strategic exit in 2021 in the pandemic. And one of the things that I noted as a general counsel was that board relationships are very challenging when they're not going well. When things are hunky-dory and rosy, you don't necessarily know what's going on under the surface, but challenging circumstances really do evoke a whole new sense of character traits in leadership. And I was very much convicted of the idea that we could be doing this better. We could be communicating more effectively. We could be sharing what we actually need with one another. We could be trusting each other in that process. And more importantly, I would have loved to have greater trust in my skills and the integrity of my words. So when I said I was going to do something, I was going to do it. If I said that something was impossible, it was probably impossible. And if I said that something was possible, please work with me to help you achieve that. And so it showed a lot of relational fractures, I think. And that was kind of the genesis of the Wayfinders Group. It took another, maybe 18 months before life was breathed into that. I was very much recovering and trying to figure out how I was going to finance the venture, which may become more relevant later on in this conversation. But I think for me, what I realized was that one of the reasons that people dislike having uncomfortable conversations is because they're either hankering back to a period that will absolve them of the need to have that conversation, or they don't want to face whatever is in them that's causing them some unwillingness. And I exist to challenge the status quo. I don't have a fear associated with that. Maybe not all guns blazing, but I think there are ways in which sensitively you can help people address some of these things. And I knew that God had a heart for reconciliation. I've had an incredible spiritual walk. And part of that has been writing books, part of that has been doing interviews like these. But I really had a conviction that God wanted me to hold out principles of reconciliation to people who don't understand, who don't know that that is possible, and help them dream into the art of the possible and let that inform not just their leadership style or their companies, but their entire lives.
Right. So I think when you deal with the CEO and executive types, and that's a lot of who we speak to within the corporate world, a lot of people I'm dealing with are very humble and really down to earth people. But when you get to the corporate world, there's a lot of ego involved, and what do I need you for? That's that. I could do this better. Look at this massive thing that I've built. And how do you get people to kind of look in the mirror and say, wait a second, maybe I'm not doing things as good as I could be?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. That was not a very successful sales approach. And I think inviting people in to have to face their own deficiencies is never going to win. Telling them you will make them look good is much more effective. Or in fact, taking away some of the challenges of some of the things that they're experiencing in their wider teams is also another good in. I think people don't understand what it is they're contributing to a situation. They also don't acknowledge perhaps how much agency they have in changing that situation. So listening. I think I think previously as a lawyer, you are quick to diagnose. I think as a mediator, I'm much, much, much more curious. I want to know, why do you feel like that? What do you think the other person is feeling at the moment? Why do you think that they're feeling that? What do you think they think about you? What do you think that they would think if you communicated to them what you're thinking right now? And again, I think that idea of dreaming, hey, you've got this strategic goal and you're struggling to achieve this mission. What would it feel like if you were able to do that? Where do you want to be in 3 to 5 to 10 years time? What's important to you right now? What difference would it make in your life if you could wake up tomorrow and this problem not be there anymore? I found that's been much more successful in garnering engagement from leaders.
And people are coming and honest with their problems, meaning I know running my own company was always something I had. We definitely had blind spots, and thank God I had a partner who we were open and honest with each other. But we then had kind of, as partners, we had blind spots, But that there is that blind spot, and it's like, okay, again, I don't. If I want a therapist, I'll find a therapist. I don't need somebody else, because I know the right direction this company should take, and I'm trying to be tough with you to kind of get where you would add value to these people.
Oh, I'm not upset. I'm interested. So for me, I think your statement stands on an assumption. I actually think a lot of leaders are really lonely. I think there are not a lot of people that leaders trust with their problems. And there is still stigma attached to going to a therapist, although less so going to a high performance coach. Everybody loves having a high performance coach these days. But I think the reality is that a lot of people really benefit from somebody creating a safe space for them to communicate what is on their mind. And that is relationship driven. And so I found that actually selling is not an effective tactic at all. Being with people and showing them that you are somebody who will sit with them in their discomfort and help them work out how from there they can get to where they want to be. Not a lot of people offer that. Why? Because a lot of people don't want to be in the trenches with you. A lot of people run when you're in the trenches. And I've had other people who have felt uncomfortable when I'm in the trenches have sidelined me. And I'm not worried about that. I don't take that personally, because I can see how that was challenging for somebody else to experience. But I also think that the weight of the challenges that a lot of executives are facing at the moment, particularly in 2025, are indicative of that nobody knows how to chart this uncharted territory. So unless you invite other people into that space, you are compounding the loneliness that you're experiencing, and you've got even more pressure on yourself to figure it out. And everybody knows that collaboration is the way forwards when you're struggling to move forwards, or you don't know which direction to go in. And I think, therefore, the question is, how do I get people to trust me, that I'm somebody that is a trusted advisor to others, but also for them? And I think a lot of that comes from recommendations.
Yeah, and that's the way that you go in from one CEO says, "Oh, this person has been great for me," and go lie down on her couch and she'll mediate for you.
And also, people don't like mediators, right? Because mediators, by definition, suggest the presence of a conflict that somebody wants to resolve. And I also don't think that reconciliation is limited to mediation. Reconciliation goes beyond that. Reconciliation is a deep dive into how you want to move forwards from whatever has happened to fracture that relationship, to fracture that trust. And so when you talk about the cultural issues that people are facing in their businesses, how many structural changes do you want to make? How many employment surveys do you want to do? How long do you want to give this before you look yourself in the mirror and say, actually, what if I have to be more honest with what's going on here and take responsibility for what I've contributed to this situation? What if there was somebody who could not only help me diagnose the problem, but sit with me and sit with my teams and give us a roadmap from how to get where we are to where we would like to be so that we can address insert issue here. Maybe it's attrition, maybe it's overspending, maybe it's reputation in the market. People come with a myriad of different challenges. And that's why I think sitting and being able to diagnose through effective listening, whilst also having the strategic nous and the professional breadth to be able to understand somebody's business model, to be able to understand the terminology, is a lot wider than just being a mediator.
So, I think one of the challenges that the marketplace in general is facing is that everyone is expendable and replaceable, and there's no real such thing as employee-employer loyalty. Best case scenario, you work at a place for 5 to 10 years, and they don't throw you out. But there's downsizing that happens all the time. There is new markets, there's new competitors. Things are moving at such a fast pace that it's not like when parents and grandparents went to work, and you could work for a company for 25, 30 years. So here it's something. So how do you give over that trust where it's like, here you're going to be safe, but it could be, if there's a market change, we're going to lay off 10,000 people, and you might be one of them. How do you kind of create that trust in a almost definitionally untrusting environment?
Yeah, I think you've got to create the trust before you need it. So this idea of trying to change people's opinion of you in the storm is probably not the best starting point. So communication is very important here, right? Because one of the things that breaches trust is when people don't take an opportunity to communicate that they have that's available to them. And if in taking that opportunity, they don't do that in a way that gives over enough information. The other side of the coin here, of course, is that you can give an employee too much information. And when you're navigating through those uncharted waters, you perhaps don't want to tell them everything that is going on. But I do think that when you've created a company culture that rests on specific values and where everyone is clear about the mission, and you make any decisions about navigating those challenges through the lens of those values and that mission, it is going to be a lot easier for you to defend your position as a leader, whatever difficult decision you have to take, because you're basing that on the North Star, not your own personal opinion, not based on who you're friends with in the company or who's been there for a certain period of time. It's mission-driven decisions that enable the company to achieve its North Star. And I think one of the reasons that this is so challenging is because a lot of companies really aren't clear on the outworking of their mission. And they certainly aren't doing that through a values-driven lens. Now, it's not for me to impose my values on my clients' situations. It's for me to hold their values up to them as a mirror, to use those to empower them to make those decisions in a way that keeps their people on side. And also, you've got to think about the people who are left behind, as well as the people that you're exiting in that situation. And it is difficult, but I think you also need to be honest about saying that it's difficult and calling a spade a spade. And that does take courage. That does take careful cultivation of language. But I think it's doable. And I've seen it done effectively, and I've also seen it done really badly.
Right. It's always difficult, and something whenever I speak to younger groups and college kids about employment can really only end in one of two ways, assuming the employee doesn't die, which would be a third way, but they either get fired or they quit. So somebody is going to be unhappy in that relationship when time for termination comes. Either the employee is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, either because they're not competent or maliciously or whatever. I mean, there could be a whole host of different reasons, or the employer has to let so the employer has to let them go because of that, or the employee is like, oh, I'm not happy here, I'm going to find a new opportunity, and kind of where that goes after. And I think that becomes a very difficult thing. And I've seen people who have left my company and they've kicked me in the shins on the way out. There was absolutely no reason to do that. I've had people that have been fired who have turned around and said, it was a great experience, thank you so much, would you act as a reference? And I'm like, absolutely, you're a great guy. It just either because the market turned or because your skills for whatever reason weren't appreciated here as much as they could be. So I think that is a very difficult, I'm going to say, was a difficult piece for me, but I'd imagine all leaders is dealing with staffing and and that turnover. So what kind of advice, or when people come in where they think this is going to be the company that they're at forever, how do you kind of get that into their head that at some point this is going to end?
I'm not convinced that anybody joins a company anymore for forever. I don't think that's the psychology of anybody kind of millennial and below. I think it's a nice idea, but I don't think that represents the trends that we're largely seeing in the market. Now, in big corporate America, of course, this is true. You want the corner office, you want the gold-plated pension or 501k, the sky's the limit. And certainly in non-corporate environments where you've got to climb the ladder to actually make the most of your career, I think that probably is more true, like the civil service or the government. But we're seeing this a lot in the UK at the moment because of the budget, some of the challenges in the wider economic environment. A lot of people have been made redundant this month who weren't expecting it, who didn't see it coming down the line. And I'm questioning, why did you not see this coming down the line? The writing's been written on the wall since October. So why was there no narrative to prepare you for this eventuality, not to cause unrest or uncertainty or to make people nervous, but it's just striking that it's been completely omitted from the comms plan of whatever the entity is. What advice would I give? I mean, I think you've got to communicate things as early as possible so that people feel like they have time to make another plan, particularly if you're letting an entire team go. Giving people as much notice as possible is almost as helpful as being able to pay them more in their redundancy package. I think redundancy is a privilege. I think there are a lot of roles whose contracts don't even entitle them to redundancy payments. And I've always seen that type of exit from a business as an opportunity. But I also think that even in times of economic downturn, there are so many personal opportunities for growth as you navigate those situations. I mean, somebody said to me years ago that a good career is where you've been promoted in one environment, where you've been fired from another environment, where you've had all of these rich experiences that it's very difficult to get if you've just been in one company for your entire career. And I think that this idea that I think comes out of a lot of tech companies, actually, we're a family and like we're really behind the mission and we're going to do this together for the next 10 years until we IPO. I think it's a fictional ideal that's kind of used as a manipulative tool to kind of keep people in an environment that may not be that healthy. And I would dissuade leaders from framing joining an organization like that, because boundaries are really important. And boundaries become most important when you have to have these difficult conversations like exiting people from your business. So I think start earlier and figure out how you communicate things in your business so that when you're in the storm, you have a map that you can follow to cause as minimal damage and ensure that the remaining hulk of the ship can continue sailing until you can rebuild.
Yeah, always easier said than done to try to have those difficult conversations, because you also don't want the person checking out too early and where it's like, oh yes, in a month from now you're going to be fired. Well, or you might be fired. So that also, you don't want people kind of sitting on pins and needles. So I think that's a tremendous challenge. So you're obviously a faithful person. So give me how your faith impacts what it is that you're doing, or if you, in terms of the Wayfinder Group, in terms of when you have these conversations, do you bring up faith with people in a direct way, indirect way? Give us a little bit of color on that.
I think it depends. I think if you're working with a faith-driven organization or a faith-driven leader, it just happens naturally. I tend to refrain from leading with faith when I'm in a secular environment or I'm advising a secular client. I think most of them probably do know that I am a person of faith. It's not something that I've ever hidden. But I have been advised by other people of faith in senior positions that when I say, I've been called to hold out kingdom principles of reconciliation and transformation, that I should just say that I work in transformation. And I found that challenging because I think you lose a bit of the color of what it is that you're trying to achieve when you hide the why. And I am spurred on by a conviction that I have been prepared for and equipped to do this work. And I think the difference between a traditional change management consultancy and what we're doing is we're creating relational change. We're creating relational progress. We are disrupting this idea that we can be content with saying, okay, we agree to disagree. Let's go our separate ways and move on. And we're saying, but actually, what about the step after that? What about the restorative part of that conversation? What if it was possible for you two to continue working together and rebuild trust as if that situation hadn't happened, that leaves you better off because it has? And it's very, very difficult to explain the motivation for that and the heart of that without referring to Jesus. So I'm always ready to give an answer for the hope that I have. But I don't get asked that often, which may mean I'm doing something wrong. Or it may be that it's so patently obvious to other people that this is something that comes out of Christian faith. And somebody said to me a few weeks ago, talking to the Wayfinders Group in the context of mediation, it's not the best name. And I said, I'm not going to have a conversation about the name. We prayed so hard over the rebrand and what the vision was and the outworking of Isaiah 43 and this idea that, yes, of my own and on my own, I cannot solve all of these problems. But with the Lord on my side, anything is possible. And he is the one who has demonstrated over and over and over again, not just that he makes a way where there is no way, but his willingness to step into situations that have no hope and inject them not just with hope, but a different and a better and an abundant future. That is surely the best picture of transformation that there is. And if that is the energy and the impetus for this work, I can't remove God from that conversation. And so, in full transparency, I pray before mediations. I think it's a wise thing to do. I pray before giving presentations or speaking engagements for wisdom, to know what to say, to see the opportunities that are before me, to act sensitively when I would rather respond or insert myself or my own ego in the conversation and say, no, not my will, but your will. What is your care for these people? What do they need? What am I not seeing? I can't do this work alone. It's heavy stuff. The people on my team, it's heavy stuff. We're doing our best. But I have been really encouraged by one thing that stuck with me from my brand designer. And he said, Leah, the Lord will always pay for what he's ordered. And so if I ever feel like I'm not in sync, or I'm overstretching, or I'm overextended, or there's not enough money, or something isn't going quite right, I'm like, maybe I'm off the center line. Maybe I need to be realigned with the Holy Spirit and try again.
Yeah, I think what's difficult about faith is it comes down to a culture, right? Meaning when there is when you could have the majority of people in a certain place feel a certain way, but not say it because the culture is such that kind of acts as a blanket on top of the way that people are actually feeling. I think that has a lot to do with, without getting political over here, but it has a lot to do with kind of the shift to the right that's happening in the United States with the rise of Trump and post-Trump, because I think there was a silent majority that were like, oh, we're not into all this other stuff that's going on. So it definitely like pushed people. And, I think faith is also one of those things which the majority of people, I think, do feel faith, whether or not they're conduct themselves within a certain religion or religious practice. Okay, becomes a different story. But it does become, well, what is kind of the culture in a certain place, and do I bring it up? And I'll just tell you one story where there was a patent attorney which I had met at a conference not so long ago, and because we met outside of kind of our regular working environment, so we had a conversation about faith, and that was part of our conversation. Whereas had it just been like kind of a secular meeting, we would have, talked about, I don't know, the weather and traffic and whatever other, mundane topics. But this way we were able to have like a much deeper conversation because we kind of met outside of business, but we met in, kind of a faith-driven, area. So the question is how to do that. And I guess with some of the change management, how to bring that up and to have people talk about their faith, because you're never supposed to talk about religion and politics. Those are two things you should never bring to work, right? So,
and yet those are two of the things that people are most struggling with, how to navigate in the workplace, right? What are the big questions that organizations are worried about because their employees are expecting them to put out a statement on X or Y? They always relate to those topics. And so this is part of the psychological safety conversation, and you talked about mental health earlier, but people do need to be able to have boundaries in terms of how they present themselves professionally, but they also need to be able to communicate who they are, and therefore piercing the veil if a boundary is crossed of their own values structure at work. And they should be able to communicate that on a one-on-one basis to their manager, if that's appropriate, or to the person who's causing the problem, if that's appropriate. And I think the idea that, even at dinner parties, you're not supposed to talk about those things. But I think our lives are much the richer for being willing to have those conversations. The question is, can people separate themselves from the response that they're getting or the engagement they're getting from another person so that that doesn't escalate into a crisis situation? And that's a question, again, of self-awareness, discipline, but also self-restraint, I think.
Right. Yeah. And there's a fine line, because if I walked into an office and someone came and they wanted to, they were trying to proselytize or evangelize, I wouldn't appreciate that. But if someone said, may God bless, God should bless your efforts, I would appreciate it. So, meaning depending on kind of how that's done. But I guess that's kind of self knowledge and.
There's cultural sensitivity too, right? You can take that curiosity and say, would it be okay if I said this? Or, I've observed this about you. So is this the right phrase to use in this context? I find it a lot when I'm dealing with Middle Eastern clients, right? You can't presume that they want to be spoken to in a particular way, but if it's one of their religious holidays, and the most important thing to them culturally is that when you greet them, that you make reference to that. And that is part of their culture. And I think that is part of relationship. Doesn't mean I have to accede to it. Doesn't mean that I have to approve of it. It doesn't mean I need to judge it. It just means that I've taken the time to understand who you are and what you need to feel seen and heard. And I can choose to show that I respect you by endorsing that and acknowledging that without it having any bearing on my worldview or my particular views.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's definitely always having that cultural sensitivity. Obviously, I'm in the Middle East, and there definitely are different cultures as someone who comes from the United States to see and to appreciate that. So you have a successful podcast. Tell us a little bit about the podcast, how it's going, and some of the highlights of the work that you're doing there that you've taken from that.
Oh, thank you. So I run the Longest Day podcast, and it does what it says on the tin. We hear about leaders' longest days. So much like your view of humble leaders, we want to get to the root of people's longest days, because we think that there's so many riches to find there in terms of how you dealt with it, who you had around you. If you had to live it again, what would you do differently? What did you learn about yourself as you experienced your longest day? What advice do you have to somebody else who's going through something similar? It's basically conversations that listeners feel like they're eavesdropping into, like when you're in a coffee shop and you've somebody in the next table is saying something really interesting. But I'm doing that with high profile leaders across society, because the thing is, they experience adversity too, but they don't necessarily have a forum for or an opportunity to communicate that. An example would be a current cabinet minister in the House of Commons in the UK. I cornered him at a fundraising event, and he's like, "You've got 90 seconds to pitch, go." And I invited him on the podcast, and he said, "I'm so excited about coming on your podcast because it's the first time I've had an opportunity to talk about this subject." And that's what it is. It's, again, creating that space to build trust, to have an effective conversation, to listen really well. It's like a counseling session in many ways. But it's also so empowering for listeners. Somebody said the other day, it's like free leadership coaching. So if that appeals to you, they're 25 minutes long. It's called The Longest Day Podcast, and it's available on all platforms.
Yeah, amazing. And it's really nice. I mean, I know the response that I get from people, and they reach out and they're like, "Oh, I heard this and something resonated." And it's always something that is nice to have and to get that feedback, and hopefully you're adding value. One final question. Give me one kind of really challenging experience that you had, maybe not your longest day, because we won't get the spoilers, but something that you had that was a challenging experience working with an executive that and you were able to see it through.
I think one of the most challenging parts of my practice is when I'm dealing with boards. And that's because there are a lot of people on a board of directors. And so if you think about traditional mediation, you might have one or two individuals who might have their representatives with them. And you will slowly work in private sessions and with them together to move things forwards. When you have 14 people, it's a little bit more challenging. And I did one last summer over 4 consecutive days by telephone. So we weren't even all in the same room. Some people got so many calls from me. Some people I spoke to once or twice. And it was such a privilege to trust the process. At the end of the first day, I was like, well, I've tried that avenue, not making any progress there. Got to the end of the second day, where on earth do I go next? Got to the end of the third day, okay, I can start to see a solution emerging. Okay, now we've just got to build consensus in respect of that solution. Okay, now we've got to get to a point where I'm not forcing the solution on these individuals, but they are taking the agency to communicate what they think needs to happen next. And it just gave me great confidence, not just in my skills as a facilitator, but just in the way that you can transform an organization that doesn't understand what it's contributing to a situation. And I think so often, even with the best will in the world, we don't know what we're bringing to a situation because we haven't really been curious about other people's experience of it. And so that was a joy to see through. It was fairly early on in my exploration of being a board mediator specifically. But it was one of my proudest moments. And, it really maintained the relationships that I already had with some of those individuals. But it really grew a newfound, I think, respect for the process from them. But also, when you trust somebody with your biggest challenges and, is this really confidential? Is this really not going anywhere else? You get to be a receptacle for all of that. And I just feel like that's an immense privilege. And God has had to do so much work in me to make me fit for that. Let's not pretend that one day I woke up and I was just able to do this. There's been so much spiritual healing that has needed to happen for me to be able to be that stable, safe place. But yeah, that was one of my favorite moments.
Amazing. Leah Brown, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your insights, and looking forward to finding opportunities for us to cross-pollinate and find areas that we'll be able to work together and help each other out. And God should continue to bless all of your efforts.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Grateful for this conversation.